The Dragon type, regarded as one of the strongest type because it gets absolutely carried, whether due to its sheer number of legendaries and their overwhelming stats, or these Pokemon's dual typing to help with their lack of advantages. But how strong is the Dragon type really compared to others? How heavily is it carried by its stats, its typing, its frequency, its moveset, and even by its alternative forms? So let's take a closer look at Dragon, the type carried by the numbers. We'll start with the most obvious characteristic of the Dragon type first, which is their base stat total, which is further subdivided into 6 categories: HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. Now looking at all 1079 regular and regional forms, we will be including megas and alternative forms later, but for now we'll just look at the regular and regional variants. These are the top 10 highest value by Pokemon for each of these categories, including for ties. So as you can see, this is HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and finally speed. Only once did a Dragon type place in the top 3 for any category, that being Guzzlord with his monstrous HP stat. But if you were looking at the entire screen and not just the strongest of each category, or just have the most basic of Pokemon knowledge, you would definitely know that there were some dragons in those top 10s. But how many were there? Looking at the total amount of top 10 placement for each type, Poison came in last with only 1, that being one of the newest Pokemon per current, who was tied on having the 10th best defense at 160. The fighting type has the highest attack on average, yet only been in the top 10 twice. None of those 2 placements came from the attack category. Continuing on, we see Bug is there 5 times, despite it having the lowest base stat on average. As we get closer to the top, we can see Steel and Rock. They are near the top due to their immense defensive capabilities that allows it to secure multiple top 10 slots. But as expected, Dragon has the most amount of top 10 appearances with 13. But as seen with the Bug type, getting into a top 10 in any category doesn't really mean much. All a Pokemon needs is extremities into 1 stat to reach top 10 heights. So let's look at average base stat amongst all Pokemon types. According to Pokemon database, these are Dragon's average scores and placement against other types. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but these numbers are inflated by megas and alternative forms. We'll look at this later on in the video, but when looking at just regular and regional Pokemon, its averages would drop to this, and its placements would also drop alongside with it, but it still on average is ranked 2.5 for each category, in comparison to the type that has the second highest rank average, which is Psychic and Fighting, both with a score of 6.67, and these are their scoring for each of their categories. You can see huge differences between Dragon and the second best, but enough of this category talk. Let's look at the whole picture, the average base stat of the types. I will be rounding to their nearest whole number, so just know that. In last is obviously the Bug type, by a huge margin. It was in the top 10 5 times, but it doesn't mean anything, because most bugs have awful stats. And those bugs who were in the top 10s also had horrid stats, outside of those that they excelled at. As we keep going right, we see types that are more commonly seen in the early routes of the game, such as Normal, Poison, Grass, and Water. Continuing rightwards, we see Ground, Fairy, Flying, and Electric. Fun fact, Flying and Electric are the only 2 types to share the same base stat averages. Now, here's the rest of the types until we come to Steel, with an average base stat score of 472, allowing it to rank in second for having the highest base stat total of all types. And then right beside it, with a score of 494, is Dragalge, or Dragalge. We're doing math here, not English, so I don't care. Now, you might question, what's the point of showing Dragalge? The thing is, when looking at total base stat of all regular and regional forms, Dragalge is able to rank itself at worst at 353rd out of all 1079 regular and regional forms in terms of total base stat, which means it ranks in the top 1/3 of all Pokemon, with only 32.7% of Pokemon existing having a larger base stat amount. Now surely, a Pokemon of this caliber would benefit a type's overall average base stat.
If Dragon had this, its averages would go down.
And that's exactly what Dragalge did. Alongside all these Pokemon you see on the screen. Each one of these Pokemon are a Dragon type, which has a base stat large enough to benefit the averages of any other type, but low enough to bring the average base stat of Dragon down. But even with all these, I guess, drawbacks, the Dragon type is still able to end up with an average base stat of 506. Truly ahead of every other type by a large margin. In fact, Steel is closer to being outside of the top 10 than it is to being ahead of Dragon. But the Dragon type was never this high to begin with, so let's look at a time frame of how Dragon was able to reach such absurd heights. I will be moving regional forms aside as their own region as to not disrupt the calculations. The Kanto region was the first region, and since it was the first, Game Freak didn't even know what they were doing with the Dragon type. It released the second fewest amount of Dragon types with 3, with these 3 averaging out to a base stat of 440. This regional average of 440 is the lowest of all regions. This means that Kanto was the weakest point in the history of Dragon types in terms of base stat total. Johto came after with only 1 Dragon type, with a base stat of 540. Johto remains the only region to not release multiple dragon types, something that will probably never be seen again. We then are seen with Hoenn, Sinnoh, and Unova. 3 straight regions that featured a box legendary Pokemon, allowing Dragon to reach its peak of power between Gen 4 and 5, making it the only 2 times where the average base stat for Dragon types in total exceeded 510. This is possibly because both of these regions of Sinnoh and Unova introduced 3 Dragon types that had a base stat total of 660 or higher. This has not been replicated since. And this is where Game Freak had to come up with a way to counter such an overwhelming imbalance by introducing the Fairy type. Because at this point, the only way to defeat dragons was to bring your own dragon. As outside of dragons, their only other weakness was ice, in which dragon can deal neutral damage back at them. Or the steel type, the only type that can resist dragon attacks. But their attacks aren't super effective against them. What the game really needed was a true dragon killer. The introduction of Fairy allowed a type to counter a dragon on both offense and defense, giving it immunity to dragon attack and super effective damage against them. If the Fairy type was never added, I'm sure every team would be fighting with 3 dragon types on their team. Now, as stated earlier, 3 dragon types with a base stat of 660 or higher has never happened since Unova, which of course would cause a decrease in the average base stat of dragon types. Kalos introduced the weakest averages of base stat for dragon types since Kanto, with a value of 457. This was of course at the time needed to weaken the dragon typing because it was so dominant. The preceding 2 regions also lowered the averages as they didn't introduce multiple high base stat dragon types. And then finally in Paldea, where we once again come across box legendaries paired up with strong paradox Pokemon, and a record for most dragon types introduced in a singular region, allows its average to come up to 505. The alternative forms are the reason why the total average amongst all dragon types is at 506, but we're not here to focus on those guys. So what does all of this show? Looking at the trend line for both average base stat and amount of dragon types, we see that there is an upward trend, meaning both quantity and quality, or rather strength of dragon types, have increased throughout the years. Now with base stat, one could simply argue that the increase is due to overall power creep in the franchise, as right here are the average base stat value for a Pokemon from the Kanto region and those of the Paldea region. Whether that is true is a video for another day. However, power creep doesn't have any factor in quantity of dragon types increasing over the years, especially when we look at the number of Pokemon released every region. We see that there is a downtrend, meaning fewer and fewer new Pokemon are seen every time a new region is released. So when combining an increasing dragon population with a declining Pokemon rate, it would cause an increase in the amount of dragon types per Pokemon released. Which is odd because when Dragon was first introduced, it was supposed to be this rare and mythical type, as it held a record for least amount of appearances through Gen 1 and 2, tied with Ghost. But over time, Dragon went from covering about 2% of the Pokédex to now at almost 7%, meaning the Dragon type is now more than 3 times as common to encounter than it was in the early days of Pokemon, and is now tied with Steel as the 4th rarest type with 73. So now you know how powerful the Dragon type is as a whole, how they rose to greatness, and their increasing population. But what about the Pokemon within the type individually, and how they compare to other Pokemon of different types? Let's look at a Pokemon that have a base stat total of 590 or higher. Why specifically 590 and not a more straightforward value of 600?
Cause we here to push dialogues, buddy.
Anyways, when looking at regular and regional form Pokemon, out of all 1079 of them, only 69 of them are able to meet this value. So for a Pokemon to even be included in this group, they must be in the top 7 percentile against all Pokemon, with less than 1 in every 15 Pokemon even having a base stat value this large. So how many Dragon types do you think achieve this threshold? If we were to assume all 69 of these Pokemon were dual typed and all types were distributed evenly, there should be 8 Dragon types that meet this condition when rounding up. There are 9 pseudo-legendary Dragon types alone that meet this requirement. In totality, out of all 69 Pokemon that were able to reach a base stat total of 590, 27 of them are associated with the Dragon type, which makes up almost 40% of all Pokemon at this level, and about 3.5 times more than what our type should have if everything was spread fairly. But now instead of looking at how strong they can be, we focus on how weak they are. When looking at all 73 regular and regional form Dragon type Pokemons together, this is how a chart would look like if they are all compared to each other based solely on their base stat. You can obviously see how top heavy they are. Now let's add some separation and sections to this graph. All Pokemon on or above this green line are those that have a base stat of 590 or higher. All the ones highlighted in yellow are those who have a base stat of 506 or higher, meaning equal to or above the average base stat of a Dragon type. And finally, everything above the red line are those with a base stat of 428 or higher, which is the average base stat of all Pokemon. And of course, everything below it being weaker than the average Pokemon. Quite the gap between the strong and the weak, as one can see. Now, despite 428 being the average, Only 46% of all Pokemon are under this value, while 54% are above it. But regardless, you can easily see that the split of dragon types above the average line is nowhere near this amount. In total, there are 21 dragon types below this line, which is less than 30% of all dragon types, and also fewer than the amount of dragon types with a base stat over 590, which is more than 35%. This shows that the dragon type is so heavily condensed on receiving strong Pokemons. As to have a base stat of 590 or higher, a Pokemon would need to be placed in the top 6.5% of all Pokemon. Yet to be below 428, you have to be in the bottom 46%, a margin 7 times larger, yet still produce fewer amount of dragon types. This also means in the remaining spaces between these ranges, there are still less dragon types than those of the upper echelon. But enough of all that. Now let's finally move on from stats and look at typing. Each type has their own individual traits that allows it to perform differently when interacting with one another. When looking at the total amount of super effective advantages, the dragon type has only one, making it the second fewest out of all types, only ahead of normal. This would be bad if it wasn't for the fact that only one dragon type in the 590 plus range was monotyped. Luckily, Pokemons are able to be dual typed to allow them to combine the characteristic of multiple types, but not all typings are good, meaning some dual typing are also bad. So how many strong dragon types are given a bad typing? There's no real way to numerically measure each type against each other to truly say which is better, but one could always rank them based on how good one thinks a type performs. A while back, I ranked all the types, but I'm not a pro at Pokemon and ranked them solely on a made-up mathematical equation that value the interaction each type has against one another. In my rankings, the 5 worst dragon dual typings were Dragon Normal, Dragon Psychic, Dragon Grass, Dragon Dark, and Dragon Ice. These 5 combinations appeared a total of 6 times out of all 26 dual type dragon types with the base stat of 590 or higher, which is about 23%. But if all combinations were used evenly, it should be around 29.5%, meaning that there should be 7.6 out of the 26 dragon types to have these typings. So, are the dragon types purposely given better type? Like I said earlier, I'm not a pro, so let's look at someone who's more suitable and knowledgeable about such a topic. Wolfie. Someone who plays Pokemon competitively, unlike me, and is a Pokemon VGC's champion. Now of course, I'm a channel with 1k subs, so I don't really have the pull to get him on the mic to speak absolute heat. So I'm just going to have to extract the information from his ranking of all 153 type combinations. In this video, his 5 lowest ranked dragon type combinations were Dragon Rock, Dragon Grass, Dragon Flying, Dragon Fighting, and Dragon Psychic. So how many times did these 5 combinations show up for the upper echelon of dragon types? A total of 7 times, which is close enough to 7.6 since we can't have a fraction of a Pokemon be dragon type. So maybe strong dragon Pokemons aren't favored to have better typing, until you look closer at Wolfie's bottomly ranked dragon combinations. In his video, only 2 dragon combinations failed to be placed in the C tier or higher, those 2 being Dragon Grass and Dragon Rock. The expected amount of Pokemons that have this typing at the base stat level is 3, yet there exists 0. Now let's compare this value to the other side, the best possible dragon typing. In my ranking, I had Dragon Steel, Dragon Fire, Dragon Water as the top 3. Wolfie had Dragon Water, Dragon Steel, Dragon Fire. Different order, but overall it's the same 3 combinations that are thought to be the best for dragon types. Of these 3 possible typing, there exists 7 Pokemon that achieve the base stat threshold of 590 or higher. Now when looking at the best and worst combinations together, we see that the best typing are used more than the expected amount, while the weakest typing is used less than the expected amount. All in all, showing that the dragon types with high stats are pushed towards being paired up with the typing that will help benefit its shortcomings, allowing them to perform even better. Now let's move on from stats and typing and look at dragon type moves, or mainly one move in particular. There are currently 4 Pokemon moves that meet the following conditions: non-exclusive, no drawback, increases speed, and increases damage output. Those 4 moves being Tidy Up, Shift Gear, Quiver Dance, and of course Dragon Dance. Magearna is the only recipient of any of the first 3 moves to have a base stat of 590 or higher. Now what about Dragon Dance? 16 dragon types with a base stat of 590 or higher has access to this move. To put this into perspective, the move Quiver Dance boosts speed, attack, and special attack, all by 1 stage, and is mainly designated towards bug type Pokemons. If the bug type on average were to receive all these buffs, the type as a whole while boosted is still weaker than the average dragon type. In fact, it would still have a lower base stat total than the second highest type of Steel, even after spending a turn just to gain these buffs. But let us assume that both a bug type and a dragon type Pokemon were set to be a physical sweeper, so only their attack and speed stat matters. Well, since the dragon type already has a higher stat total overall, the total amount of stat it gains from using a status move is greater than that of the bug type, since a larger number is being multiplied, allowing dragon to reach insane stat levels. It's no wonder why dragon types are so prevalent in the Uber tier. as one simple move can set them to be in a position to sweep the entire board if proper counters aren't brought against them. A second use of Dragon Dance might just win the game by itself. And looking at all 16 high stated Dragon type Pokemons that have access to Dragon Dance, 10 of them are stated to use Dragon Dance in their moveset according to Smogon. The other 6 are because they simply have a larger special attack value than attack, and geared towards being built as a special attacker, so using Dragon Dance to boost attack wouldn't make any sense. But in general, giving a type that already exceeds far ahead of other types a move that not only increases its chance of attacking first, but also increasing the chance of said moves knocking a Pokemon out is quite preposterous to the overall balance of the game. Now, let's finally look at the biggest reason on why most people think the Dragon type is above the rest in terms of raw strength, which is Megas and alternative forms. We'll take a look at Megas first. A Mega Evolved Pokemon allows a Pokemon's base stat total to increase by 100, allowing them to reach new heights. Such a mechanic could have easily been used to allow for other types to pose themselves as strong and compete against Dragon, if it wasn't for the fact that Dragon is the second most commonly seen type amongst all Mega evolutions, with 9 Megas possessing the type. Only Psychic has more at 10, and as one can expect, all Mega Dragon Pokemon achieve the 590 base stat mark. You might be wondering, a Mega Pokemon hitting 590 base stat total isn't that impressive, with a bonus 100 stat gain from evolution. Yet, 15 types has a Mega Pokemon that fails to reach such a benchmark. The only other 2 types that have all their appointed Megas with a total this great or higher is Grass and Rock, which alluded to before are bad types and each only had 3 Megas compared to Dragon's 9. But what about when you look at these same types compared to their alternative forms and the strength of those Pokemon? According to Pokemon database, Grass has 11 alternative forms and Rock had 5. Only one time do any of those 16 hit the 590 mark, that being Skyform Shaman. The other 15 are practically just redesign of already existing Pokemon, such as Sized Pumpkaboo, Gourgeist, or Time-based Lycanroc. There's also Ogerpon with the same stat, just different typing. Dragon, on the other hand, also has 11 alternative form Pokemon, and only 3 times does it fail to hit the 590 mark, that being Zygarde 10% form and the Goofy Tatsugiri forms. The 8 that do meet the threshold are way above and beyond just that level, at a stat value of 680 or higher. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, obviously, since 85% of all Megas and alternative form Dragon types meet a high standard, when they get grouped up with all the regular Pokemon, it increases the overall strength of the type. But by how much? How much can the already most powerful type benefit with these inclusions? The most. The Dragon type average base stat increases by 35 when you add the Megas and alternative forms into consideration. Every other type gained less than 30 average base stat when you include for all their Pokemon as well. This would also mean that the average base stat for Dragon has increased by the highest percentage also, at about 7%. And these boosts allow Dragon to lead in the largest increase of HP, special attack, special defense, and speed across all types, with it also having the single largest average stat increase of any stat category, with his special attack increasing by a value of 9.1. This is the only time any type had any of its value increased by above 8. And these values allow it to have the current rankings as seen on Pokemon database, as top 2 in every category but defense, where it ranks 4th, which is a better overall ranking when compared to the pre-Mega Evolution and Alternative Form ranking, going from an average rank of 2.5 to now 2. These values alone can easily cause one to think that Dragon just might be the strongest. But what do you guys think? Should this once rare and mythical type receive all these special treatment of high stat, good typing, strong setup move, and additional forms, despite the fact that they have indeed become more abundant? Or do you guys agree with me that Dragon is a type carried by the numbers?